Hello, everybody, and welcome back to my channel. Or if you're new here, hi, hello, I'm Spooky. Welcome. Thanks so much for being here. It's been a little bit of a minute to see you all, and I do apologize. But we're not here for that. We're here today to talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women or missing and murdered Indigenous persons. Now, I was trying to get this video out on May 5th. Unfortunately, that did not happen. So we're kind of going to do this all-encompassing story, and at the very, very end, I'm going to include some people who are still considered missing on the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So I will leave links down below for everything if you want to go check it out and all sources that I have scavenged for all of this information. So, with all that being said, grab a coffee, grab a blanket, and let's dive on into the missing and murdered Indigenous people. When something goes missing, time matters. So within those first few hours and days, witnesses and everything in between become this massively crucial part of finding them. But sometimes what happens is when a disappearance occurs, it doesn't actually receive immediate response. They have to fight to convince people to even look into the family member. There are systems 9 times out of 10 that are responsible for documenting missing people that don't actually communicate properly with one another. So today we're going to dive into the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, often shortened to MMIW. However, you may also hear MMIP, which is Missing and Murdered Indigenous People, meaning that this broader term now encompasses Indigenous men, boys, girls, women, and two-spirited people that are all affected by this crisis. Now, this video is not going to cover every single case or explain every single part of this very complicated issue, but I'm hoping to kind of just do a small introduction on what this movement represents and why so many cases might receive limited attention and can allow someone to seemingly disappear from more than just their community. They can disappear from the news, from databases, and sometimes an official record altogether. So MMIW, as I said before, stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. It is both a description of this ongoing crisis and the name of the movement created to bring attention to Indigenous women and girls who have gone missing or have been murdered. Although this movement is commonly associated within the United States and Canada, violence against Indigenous women and the struggle to accurately document that violence extends beyond one country. The Bureau of Indian Affairs states that Native American and Alaskan Native communities have experienced the disproportionately high levels of assault, abduction, murder, and other forms of violence for decades. So this is not just simply a collection of unrelated crimes. It is a crisis influenced by a long history of forced removal, broken engagements, family separation, land loss, discrimination, and government properties. That history does not excuse anyone who harms another person. It does sometimes help explain why certain communities may face higher levels of vulnerability while also having fewer resources available when something does go wrong. One of the most widely repeated statistics comes from a National Institute of Justice study. It found that 4 out of 5 American Indian and Alaskan Native women have experienced violence during their lifetime. That is 84.3%. And that same study also found that 56.1% have experienced sexual violence. And those numbers are very difficult to hear. And unfortunately, those statistics within that community have become strangely easy to ignore. We hear percentage, understand that it is terrible, but we kind of ignore it and move on with our day. It is important to remember what those numbers actually represent. It represents someone's daughter, mother, sister, aunt, best friend, partner, a classmate, a coworker, or a neighbor. And behind every missing person poster is a family waiting for an answer. One of the biggest problems surrounding MMIW is the fact that we don't have an exact number, and we don't have a reliable count of every missing or murdered Indigenous person. And some cases are reported to local police, while others may involve tribal law enforcement, county authorities, state police, FBI, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs. One case entered into one database might not be updated and entered into another database. In some cases, are not entered correctly at all, while others, while they may be reported, are never entered. A frequently cited example comes from 2016. During that year, the National Crime Information Center recorded 5,712 reports involving missing American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls. However, only 116 of those cases were logged into NamUs, the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. That does not necessarily mean thousands of people were actively missing at the time, but the database can measure and categorize information differently. But it does demonstrate an enormous gap between systems. If one database does show a case and another one does not, investigators, researchers, journalists, and members of the public may be working with an incomplete picture. NamUs itself warns that its reports do not represent every missing, unidentified, or unclaimed person in the country, and cases must be reported to the system by law enforcement, or in certain circumstances, by families, and some records are not publicly viewable. So when you hear someone say, why don't we know exactly how many people are missing? Part of the answer is that the United States doesn't really operate one perfectly connected missing person system. It operates on multiple systems that don't always communicate effectively or properly. One thing that I've noticed while researching this is racial misclassification. So, an Indigenous person may be incorrectly listed in the database as white, Hispanic, Asian, or any other racial category. Sometimes this happens because officials make assumptions based on appearance, while sometimes a forum does not allow for multiple identities. Sometimes the person entering the information may not know the individual's tribal affiliation and may not ask the family. And once incorrect information is entered, it can follow the case. Researchers studying missing and murdered Native women and children have identified that racial misclassification as a serious barrier to understanding the true scale of the crisis. They have also identified inconsistent policies and poor coordination between tribal and non tribal agencies. So, misclassification matters for more than just statistics. A family is searching a database for their missing loved one, but the system has classified them underneath a different race, or an investigator trying to compare unidentified remains with a missing person's record, but the racial categories don't match. A mistake in a form can become a massive barrier between a missing person and their name. And when researchers later tried to determine how many Indigenous people have disappeared, that person unfortunately cannot be counted due to this classification. I wanted to dive in a little bit to jurisdiction, and in a normal, ordinary language, jurisdiction just means determining which agency or court has the legal authority to handle a case. With this particular thing, it's really hard because you are fighting between the tribal law enforcement and the outside law enforcement. There are multiple questions that span across this. Where did the crime happen? Was it on tribal land, federal land, state land, or private property? Is the victim a tribal citizen? Is the suspected offender Indigenous or non-Indigenous? What type of crime occurred? What tribal, state, local, or federal laws apply? And so on. These questions can influence whether a case is handled by tribal police, a county sheriff, state authorities, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or even the FBI. And sometimes several agencies have some responsibility to that case. While sometimes responsibility is so massively unclear, they kind of don't know what to do with the case from the very beginning. And fighting over that, a case can lose valuable time while agencies determine who to take the lead and how to move forward. A National Institute of Justice supported study in Nebraska identified that jurisdictional complications, weak coordination, inconsistent policies, and limited relationships between tribal and non tribal law enforcement are barriers in missing person investigations involving Native people. This does not mean that every single agency refuses to cooperate, but there are investigators, advocates, tribal leaders, victim specialists, and volunteers doing some incredibly difficult work. But even those dedicated people can be limited by a fragmented system. A family should not have to understand a full structure of federal Indian law before someone even begins searching for their loved one. And they should not have to balance between agencies while each office explains why the case doesn't belong to them but belongs to someone else. And when someone is missing, especially within those short few hours, the priority should be finding them and not battling who takes over. There are two main things that I feel like have a massive, I guess you could say, issue with it is in the fact that it's sometimes in rural and remote locations and there's delays in reporting. A lot of these reservations and communities live in rural and remote areas where law enforcement doesn't really cover that type of territory, and sometimes people just don't know who to call when something like this happens. There's also fewer surveillance cameras, fewer nearby businesses, and even fewer witnesses. And with the delay in reporting, sometimes people can just up and leave or go on a trip and never come home. So that delayed time and thinking, oh, they'll come back eventually, or something of that nature, also causes a delay in reporting, which means you might not know that they're actually missing or something has happened to them well over 48 hours. Some families want to report as soon as they think someone might be in danger, but they also get this encountered resistance almost, because adults do have the legal right to up and leave voluntarily. And because of that, sometimes an initial report may be treated as someone just choosing to leave. Sometimes, and especially in this day and age, in which I hope it wouldn't be, but it kind of is that law enforcement also may point to substance abuse, unstable housing, prior disappearances, mental health, or relationship problems, and assume that the person will eventually return. We've seen a lot of heavy assuming in a lot of missing person cases just due to a simple blip in their background instead of actually seeing the person for who they are in that moment. These circumstances do not make someone less deserving of an investigation, and in fact, vulnerability should create more urgency, not less. And family members often know way more than those law enforcement officers who are making an assumption. They know when family members left their medication, they know that someone wouldn't abandon their children or something of that nature. And it's often disheartening when they don't take that seriously and the families aren't listened to, and especially when they describe the behavior that is completely out of character. A lot of times law enforcement will just chalk it up to something that might be in their past, but is not at all in their present. There is one thing that I also wanted to highlight about these disappearances. The fact that a lot of times we blame someone for their disappearance. Language can quietly influence how public views are of a missing person. A headline may focus on an arrest record, an article may emphasize a substance use. And we've seen that more recently with like the Lisk case, the Long Island serial killer case, where they use the women's mugshots, where they talk about them being sex workers or something of that nature, and they call them some awful high things or describe their lifestyle as a high risk lifestyle. It's disheartening because that doesn't change what happened to these people. A comment section may even ask why they were at a certain location, why were they with a certain particular person, or why they did not leave this abusive relationship. And yet, none of those things explain why the person disappeared. And none of them explain anything, and none of them even make the violence acceptable. Someone experiencing addiction, involved in sex work, criminal records, someone who's unhoused, or someone who has previously gone missing can actually still be in danger when they disappear again. A victim does not have to have a perfect life for their own life to matter. And I feel like, especially in these cases, a lot of people almost just shun them and don't actually care about the fact that they're missing or murdered. And they should, because that person still had a life that was worth living. When coverage focuses more heavily on the person's struggles than on the circumstances of their disappearance, the public may become less likely to share the case or submit information. And that judgment also creates another form of disappearance. That individual is no longer seen as a whole being. They've become this stereotype. And it honestly is more frustrating when you see all of these missing pictures, but yet you don't know anything about them except for something that isn't even attached in real life. Human trafficking also is very attached to the MMIW or MMIP, but it's important to also remember that making assumptions for every disappearance isn't always true. So, like, not every missing Indigenous person has been trafficked, and not every disappearance involves an organized traffic network. Traffickers and other offenders often do target people with limited resources, unstable housing, previous trauma, or weak connections to almost isolate them to remove them. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs has identified limited training and reluctance or fear among victims and shortages in victim service resources as barriers to recognizing and investigating traffic involving Native victims. Trafficking can also look very different from the dramatic kidnappings often show in movies. It can involve a romantic partner, a family member, and it begins with promises of housing, work, stability, transportation, money, or even just emotional support. And the danger is not always just a stranger in a parking lot. Sometimes the danger is someone that the victim knows very well. But it's not always about trafficking. Sometimes they just disappear because of other factors that are not trafficking. There is a massive recognizable symbol of the MMIW movement, and it is the red handprint across the mouth. This image represents voices that have been silenced. It represents people who were not heard when they asked for help. It represents victims whose stories were ignored. And it represents families who have had to shout simply to make the world pay attention. Red dresses are also frequently used as symbols of missing and Indigenous women and girls. Empty red dresses displayed in public spaces represent the absence left behind by those who never came home. And those symbols are powerful because they force us to confront that absence. A dress should have a person inside. A chair at a family gathering should not remain empty year after year. And a mother should not have to keep her phone beside her bed every night waiting for a call that may never come. While there have been many efforts to improve the response, the Bureau of Indian Affairs operates a missing and murdered unit focused on missing, murdered, and human trafficking cases involving American Indians and Alaska Natives. The unit works with tribal, federal, state, and local agencies and maintains public profiles for certain active cases when families have authorized their release. NAMIS has also expanded outreach and support for tribal communities and provides a centralized system where missing persons and unidentified remains cases can be compared across jurisdictional boundaries. Some states have created task force, improved alert systems, passed legislation, or even commissioned reports to better understand the crisis. But creating a task force is not the same as solving a case, obviously. Passing a law is not the same as successfully implementing it, and acknowledging the problem, as we all know, is only the beginning. Real process does require accurate data, trained investigators, long-term funding, cooperation between all agencies, and culturally informed victim services, as well as direct involvement from Indigenous communities. Solutions should not simply be imposed on tribal nations. Indigenous families, advocates, and leaders must have a meaningful role in deciding how the system operates because they know what the system is lacking, that a lot of us don't. Before I ended the video, I did want to highlight a few of these missing person cases who remain listed as missing by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I am just giving a brief introduction of each case. I will flash their picture on the screen, but I do highly encourage you to visit the official case pages down below. It's a very tragic thing, and I hope in due time we get better with reporting or helping or even having legislation in place that we can help push forward and reduce this number in a very helpful way, but also maybe bring more awareness in due time. Khadija Rose Britton has been missing from Clove, California since February 10th of 2018. According to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, she was 23 years old when she disappeared, and she is a member of the Round Valley Indian tribe. She is described as 5 foot 8 inches, weighing approximately 180 pounds, with black hair and brown eyes. She has tattoos on her right arm, and if I butcher this, I'm so sorry, that read Britain and Wailaki. Her case remains open and is being investigated by the FBI's Santa Rosa office and the Bureau of Indian Affairs Missing and Murdered Unit. Linda Grover, who also uses the names Linda Four Horns and Linda Moore, has been missing since December of 2001. She was last known to be in Rapid City, South Dakota. She is described as having black hair, brown eyes, and weighing approximately 150 pounds. She is affiliated with the Rosebud tribe of the Rosebud Indian Reservation, and her disappearance remains an open Bureau of Indian Affairs Missing and Murdered Unit case. John Edmund Carip has been missing from Sandy, Utah since August 11th of 2024. He's described as 5 feet 11 inches and approximately 200 pounds with black hair and brown eyes. He was reported last seen wearing a black jacket, black shirt, and black pants. John is affiliated with the Ute Indian tribe of the Uinta and Array Reservation. His case does remain open and is being investigated by the Sandy Police Department and the Bureau of Indian Affairs Missing and Murdered Unit. Kim Moses has been missing from Bristow, Oklahoma since February 4th of 1977. He was 20 years old when he disappeared. Kim is described as 5 foot 10 inches, weighing approximately 180 pounds, with brown hair and brown eyes. He was reportedly last seen wearing blue jeans and a dark jacket, and he is a member of the Kiowa tribe. His case remains open and is being investigated by the Bureau of Indian Affairs Missing and Murdered Unit, as well as the Muskogee Nation Light Horse Police Department. This movement asks us to do something very simple but extremely important, and that is to pay attention. Pay attention when a family says that someone is missing and it's not like them. Pay attention when communities tell us that the system is not working, and pay attention when a name has disappeared from the headlines but this person still has not been found. No one should receive less urgency because of their race, income, address, history, or even the circumstances of their life. And no family should have to prove that their loved one is worthy of being searched for. I will, as always, leave official resources and missing person pages in the description below. So please, if you would like, take a few minutes to look at the photographs, read the names, or even share some of the pages if you feel so inclined. Because, as always, awareness alone will not solve this crisis, but silence has never solved it either. I hope you all have a beautiful week. And as always, stay spooky, my friends.